November 10th, 1943. Reschlin Test Center, north of Berlin. Cold air slips through the half-open hangar doors, bringing with it the smell of wet pine and coal smoke. Inside, the concrete floor echoes with the clatter of tools and the hollow ring of boot heels. Sodium lamps hum overhead, throwing a yellow haze over a shape that looks almost absurd under German markings. The American fighter sits low and heavy on its wide undercarriage, in a mottled olive drab now streaked with mud and oil. Over the stars and bars on its fuselage, someone has roughly painted black crosses. The cowl is still in place, the big four-bladed prop frozen at an odd angle. Blades nicked by stones from some forgotten runway in Normandy or Britain. Oberingenieur Karl-Heinz Müller stops a few paces short of the nose and just looks at it. He has spent years around Messerschmitts and Focke-Wulfs, machines that look lean and predatory even when parked. This one looks different, thick, overfed, an armored fist instead of a sword. Behind him, a younger engineer. Lieutenant der Reserve Weber shifts a clipboard from one gloved hand to the other. So that is the famous Thunderbolt. Weber mutters, "They say it flies like a brick at low altitude." Karl grunts. Bricks do not escort bombers to Bremen and back. Do not underestimate a brick that climbs to 10,000 meters, down near the wing root. A Luftwaffe technician kicks a wheel chock into place and waves to the crane crew. Chains rattle as a mobile gantry trundles into position in front of the nose. The hangar doors rumble shut behind them, cutting off the gray daylight, trapping the smell of fuel and hot oil from the ferry flight that brought the captured machine here. On the concrete near the tail, someone has chalked in block letters, Pratt Whitney R-2800 do not damage. It makes Karl smile despite himself. The Americans label everything, but the designation also makes his jaw tighten. 2,800 cubic inches. He has already calculated roughly 46 liters of displacement, a radial with 18 cylinders. Bigger than anything Germany has managed to put into mass service in a fighter. Wikipedia. Begin with the cowl, he says. Photographs from every angle. Then we open it. Cameras click as the photographers circle the nose. Measuring tapes snaking across the dull paint. Every few seconds a shutter snaps, preserving for Berlin each fastener, each panel line. When they are done, the technicians swarm forward. The ring of bolts around the cowl comes off first. There is no sense of delicate hand fitting. The cowl sections drop away in big, heavy petals that take 2 men each to carry. The panels are thick, their edges reinforced, the fasteners rugged and honest, made to be opened and closed hundreds of times by whoever happens to be on duty that day. As the last piece comes free, the engine is revealed. It fills the circle of the fuselage completely. Metal and plumbing pressed right up to the limit. 2 rings of cylinders sit like tiers in some industrial amphitheater, each one banded with cooling fins that catch the lamplight. Steel push rods, fat ignition cables, and oil lines crisscross the front like the muscles and veins of a powerful animal. The black dome of the propeller reduction gear juts from the center, its surface scuffed but intact. Weber lets out a low whistle. Got him, Himmel. Karl steps closer until he can smell the baked-on oil on the cylinder fins and the faint tang of burned high-octane fuel lingering in the exhaust stubs. He reaches out and runs a finger along one of the wide cooling fins, feeling how evenly spaced they are, how consistently machined, not hand-filed, not adjusted by a fitter with a rasp to make 2 parts agree. These were made, thousands of them, to be exactly the same. He glances at a small rectangle riveted to the accessory case, half hidden by grime. The letters are tiny, but the meaning is enormous. Pratt Whitney. Aircraft R-2800-21. Serial nodes XXXXX. There is nothing exotic about the numbers, nothing mysterious about the type. What unsettles him is the quiet confidence in the plate itself, in the way each component around it carries its own clear stamping, its own serial, like soldiers in perfect uniform. This engine is not the product of a single genius designer or a single carefully guarded factory. It is the visible tip of a vast system. Notice the fasteners, he tells Weber softly. See how many are identical. Same heads, same thread, same length, and the safety wire. Neat. Always the same pattern. This is not the work of a master craftsman. It is made so that anyone with basic training can service it quickly. Weber shrugs. Still impressed, but not yet worried. We do the same. Not like this. Carl replies. In his mind, he sees the engine shops back home, the shortages, the hurried substitutions of inferior alloys, the engines that come back from the front with connecting rods broken, bearings scorched, valves burned because there were not enough hours or enough skilled hands. They unbolt the big exhaust collector ring, and now more of the machinery behind the engine comes into view. Fat ducts disappear back into the fuselage, vanishing toward the tail where the Americans have hidden their turbocharger. That mysterious heart that lets this overweight brute breathe at 11,000 meters while German fighters wheeze and cough. Wikipedia, look at the thickness of those pipes. One of the mechanics says, you could drive a truck over them. Carl is thinking the same thing. Everything is overbuilt, designed not just to work, but to survive abuse, wrong mixture settings, over-boosted climbs, the odd bullet or flak splinter. He bends to inspect a removed bracket that has been laid carefully on a cloth. The surface finish is not elegant, but it is consistent. No chatter marks from a dull cutter, no last-minute hand filing to make the holes line up. The part has been stamped, drilled, and finished by machines that will repeat the process 1,000, 10,000 times without complaint. In a distant corner of the hangar, someone starts a compressor. The sudden thrum makes everyone flinch, nerves on edge from months of air raid sirens and explosions. For a moment, Carl hears in that sound the endless factories of America, running day and night, untouched by bombs, feeding assembly lines that turn out more of these engines every week than Germany can manage in a month. That, he realizes, is what they are truly dismantling here. Not just one radial, but a glimpse of an enemy industry. He straightens slowly, his knees cracking in protest, and looks again at the exposed R-2800. The cylinder fins glint under the lamps. Oil still beads in the folds of metal. Somewhere a drop falls to the floor with a soft tick. Behind him, Weber asks, half joking. So, Herr Oberingenieur, what do you think, can we build one like this? Carl does not answer immediately. His eyes follow the fat turbo duct as it disappears into the dim fuselage, towards systems they have not even uncovered yet. First, he says at last, we will see what they have done with the rest of it. He nods to the men with spanners and pry bars. The next panels along the fuselage come off with reluctant squeals of rivets and paint. The Germans lean in, eager, not yet realizing that with every bolt they loosen, they are unscrewing the last illusions they still have about this war. The next morning, frost lies thin and brittle along the edge of the taxiway outside Rechlin. Inside the hangar, the cold is held at bay by a pair of red glowing coke stoves and the sheer body heat of men bent over metal. The captured Thunderbolt sits on trestles now, cowling stacked like armor plates against one wall. The engine hoist creaks as chains take the weight of the R-2800. 4 men on wrenches grunt in unison as they loosen the mounts. A final bolt comes free. Someone shouts a warning, and the massive radial sways gently into the air, dangling from the hook like the heart of some mechanical titan. Bring it forward. Slowly, Carl calls. They guide the engine onto a special stand built overnight from whatever steel the workshop could spare. When the chains go slack, the stand groans but holds. Up close, with nothing around it, the R-2800 looks even bigger. The cylinders jut out like muscles, exhaust stubs gaping like open mouths. Weber stands by with his clipboard, already filling the first page. Engine removed intact. No visible battle damage. All connections standard threaded or flanged. No special tools required for extraction. Carl runs his eyes over the front of the engine. Begin with the ignition system. The magnetos come off first. The Germans expect something unusual, some exotic distributor to match the engine's reputation. Instead, they find a system that is robust and familiar, but executed with obsessive consistency. Twin plugs for each cylinder, twin leads, each tagged with tiny stamped markers. Harness clamps that are all the same size, all interchangeable. Redundancy, Weber notes aloud. Everywhere, redundancy and standardization. Carl corrects. The real trick is not designing a magneto. It is designing one that any 19-year-old mechanic can replace at 3 in the morning on a wet field. He picks up one of the ignition harnesses, turning it over in his hands. The rubber insulation is thick, the fittings solid. It is heavier than it needs to be. But he knows at once that it will not crack in the cold or blister in the heat. It will not betray the pilot because some factory had to save a kilogram of rubber. A pair of mechanics begin to strip the accessories from the back of the engine. Fuel pump, oil pump, the pressure carburetor that feeds this monster at all attitudes. Each unit comes free cleanly, its mounting bolts accessible, its fittings clearly marked. There are no awkward brackets tucked behind impossible corners, no hand-bent tubes forced to fit. On a bench, a fitter sets one of the pumps beside its German equivalent from a BMW 801. The contrast is painful. The American unit is chunkier, less elegant in outline, but its casting is clean, the machining precise, the standard bolts and unions almost boring in their regularity. The German pump looks like what it is, the work of a handful of gifted specialists fighting bad material and shortage of time. They pull one of the cylinder heads. It comes away with a heave and a curse, heavier than anyone expects. On the inside, the combustion chamber is smooth, the valves broad-faced and solid. When they push the valve stems out, there are murmurs. Sodium-cooled, Weber says, tracing the hollow stem with a fingertip. They use it everywhere now. They can afford to, Carl answers. He calculates in his head what it would take to equip every German fighter like this. The alloys, the labor, the competing priority lists from other ministries. He feels the weight of all of that settle on his shoulders. They measure piston diameter, ring thickness, connecting rod dimensions. Every time Carl expects to find some daring thin section, some fragile attempt to squeeze a little more performance from scarce metal, he finds instead generous margins, bearings that will forgive dirty oil, pistons that will not crack if the pilot must use emergency power 1 minute longer than the manual allows. At the rear of the fuselage, another team has opened the belly of the Thunderbolt. Panel after panel lies on the floor, chalked with numbers. A crane has already eased out the turbocharger assembly, still stained from exhaust. When Carl comes over, wiping oil from his fingers on a rag, to look at it, he sees at once that this is the true marvel. The turbine housing is massive, fed by thick pipes that curve like artillery barrels. The compressor section is bolted on with a confidence that seems almost arrogant. Between and around them, heat shields, brackets, and control linkages nest together in an intricate but orderly web, too complicated for the field. One of the Luftwaffe officers says dismissively, "1 bullet in this and it is finished." "Maybe," Carl replies. He taps the housing with his knuckles. The ring gives off a dull, solid sound, but they can afford for some of them not to come back. Not because of this. He crouches to examine the wastegate controls, the automatic regulators that keep the boost steady as the Thunderbolt climbs through ragged layers of air. Where German fighters rely on careful pilot hands, this brute carries a hidden assistant made of springs and diaphragms and valves. It is as if the American engineers have assumed their pilots will be busy with other things and designed the machine accordingly. "We could build something like this," Weber insists quietly. Given the materials, the time, Carl smiles without humor. We could build one, perhaps 100. They build thousands, and each one is like the last. That is the difference. He straightens and looks back down the length of the disemboweled fuselage. Every frame, every longeron, every bracket that holds the turbo's ducts in place tells the same story. No frills, no unnecessary artistry, just solid, repeatable solutions that almost invite mass production. The sound of distant engines filters into the hangar, heavy, many-engined thunder, somewhere far above the clouds. Heads tilt instinctively. Everyone listens for the rising pitch that means the bombers are coming here, to them. The sound fades instead, sliding away towards some other city that will take the pounding today. Carl stares at the gutted Thunderbolt as the drone drifts off. He feels a chill that has nothing to do with November air. Up there, he knows, are aircraft built around engines like this very one, flying sacrifice for the next wave, and the next, and the next. The turbocharger on the bench, the radial on its stand, the clean mechanical handwriting in every bolt and bracket all whisper the same thing. This is not a single captured airplane. This is a sample, a representative of a species being produced in numbers they cannot match. Continue the teardown, he says quietly. I want every part catalogued, every material estimated, every shortcut they did not have to take. In his mind, the question that Weber asked yesterday hovers again. Can we build one like this? He realizes now that it is the wrong question. The right one is more frightening. Can we build enough? 2 days later, the Thunderbolt no longer looks like an airplane. Where once there was a squat, powerful fighter, there are now islands of parts on numbered tables, engine accessories on one row, turbo components on another, control cables coiled in careful loops, fuselage frames propped up like ribs in a butcher's shop. On one bench, an entire wing sits opened, its skin peeled back so that the fuel tanks and gun bays gape naked under the hangar lights. The air smells of cutting oil and hot metal. At one end of the hall, a technician leans into a sputtering, abrasive saw, sparks spraying as he slices a section from one of the Thunderbolt's cylinder heads for metallurgical analysis. The glowing crescent falls into a steel tray with a hiss. Carl stands beside a rolling chalkboard covered with figures. Around him, in a semicircle of folding chairs and upturned crates, sit an assortment of Luftwaffe officers, ministry officials, and fellow engineers. Tunics creak as they shift. Pens poised, some faces skeptical, some wary. On the board, he has written 3 names in block letters. R-2800, BMW 1801, DB 605. Below each column, rows of numbers march down the slate. Displacement, takeoff power, rated altitude, weight, specific fuel consumption, time between major overhaul. Gentlemen, Carl begins, his voice steady. We have completed preliminary measurements and material testing on the captured Pratt and Whitney engine, as well as a detailed comparison with our own frontline power plants. He taps the chalk next to the American column, on paper. You will see that the R-2800 is not magical. It does not achieve significantly higher power per liter than the BMW 801. It is not much lighter. In some respects, in fact, it is heavier than our engines for the same output. An officer with a fighter pilot's thin, impatient face leans forward. Then what is all this fuss about? Herr Oberingenieur. Carl does not answer immediately. Instead, he lifts a small tray from a nearby table and carries it to the front. In it lie 3 valve stems, each tagged with a scrap of card. 1 American, 2 German. He holds up the first DB 605 Stuttgart production, July of this year. High-temperature steel, partially substitutional alloys due to shortages. He passes it along the front row. The surface is clean but slightly pitted. Under magnification, they know. The grain will show the hurried compromises of a nation under blockade. The second, BMW 801 from a returned engine with 48 hours service. Note the wear marks on the stem. The third, R-2800 from our Thunderbolt. At least 100 hours of operation, according to captured maintenance logs. Sodium-filled, as you saw. We sectioned the head this morning. As the American valve makes its way from hand to hand, the murmur changes tone. The stem is smooth, the face barely marked. Whatever coating it carries has endured heat and abuse that would have sent their own valves to the scrap bin long ago. The difference, Carl says quietly, is not in brilliance of design, but in the reliability, hour after hour. They have chosen conservative limits and then built an engine that will live at those limits in the hands of average men. He gestures to the board again. Our engines are thoroughbreds. Demanding. Finely tuned. They give magnificent performance for a short time, with careful handling, on fuel that is increasingly difficult to supply of sufficient quality. He taps the R-2800 column. This is a draft horse. It is not elegant, but it will pull all day, every day, across a continent. One of the ministry men frowns. You suggest we abandon high performance in favor of such brute construction? I suggest, Carl replies, that it no longer matters what we design if we cannot manufacture it in the numbers and with the consistency that they can. He nods to Weber, who wheels forward another board. This one carries photographs and notes, close-ups of machining marks on American bearing shells, micrographs of grain structure in their alloy, hardness test impressions side by side with German parts. Weber points with a steel ruler. Please note the uniformity. We tested 3 bearings from different positions in the engine, all within half a Rockwell point of one another. Heat treatment is not just adequate. It is precise, repeatable. Carl adds, we also cut samples from non-critical structures, wing ribs, brackets. Even there, the quality is high. They do not economize where we are forced to. The fighter officer shakes his head. Very impressive, I'm sure. But our pilots report that these Thunderbolts are clumsy at low altitude. They cannot follow a Focke-Wulf in a tight turn. They dive well, yes, but they are heavy. Surely that is a weakness we can exploit. Carl has heard similar arguments before, in other rooms, about other enemy machines. He walks to a large chart pinned to the wall. It is not technical. It is a graph of production numbers, hastily assembled from intelligence reports and estimates. Major, he says gently, what you describe is tactics. You ask how to defeat a single Thunderbolt in a single engagement. That is your profession. I must look at something else. He taps the rising American line. This is how many Thunderbolts they will have available in 6 months, based on current output. This assumes no increase in capacity, which our intelligence believes is optimistic. This, he indicates the flatter German curve, is how many fighters we can equip with BMW 801s or DB605s in the same period, taking into account bomb damage and material shortages. The room is silent for a moment. Somewhere beyond the hangar, a train whistle blows, thin and distant in the winter air. It does not matter. Carl continues quietly. If a Focke-Wulf can turn a little tighter, it does not matter if a skilled pilot can coax an advantage from our engines at a certain altitude. What matters is that their engines do not fail as often, that they can be changed quickly, that they can be produced faster than we can shoot them down. He turns to the table where the R-2800 sits in pieces. Someone has laid the pistons in a neat row, their crowns polished clean. He picks one up, hefts it. We ran some calculations, he says, almost to himself. With this much cylinder wall thickness, with these bearing surfaces, with this oil system, they could increase power considerably if they wished. Yet they have chosen to be conservative. Weber adds softly, they can afford to leave performance in reserve. We cannot. We are forced to take risks in design because we are already behind, and in doing so, we fall further behind in reliability. The ministry official clears his throat. Your conclusion, Oberingenieur. Karl looks around the circle. Faces he knows from other projects, other desperate attempts to wring more from less. In their eyes, he sees fatigue, pride, denial, and, in a few, the same creeping realization that has settled over him since the first cowl panel came off. My conclusion, he says, the words tasting like cold iron, is that this engine is not merely a technical opponent. It is proof that our enemy now possesses an industrial strength and a manufacturing discipline that we cannot match in the time remaining to us. We can study it, learn from it, perhaps copy elements, but we cannot recreate the conditions that produced it. He sets the piston down carefully, as if it might shatter something fragile in the air between them. What you see on those tables is not just a captured fighter. It is an answer to a question we did not wish to ask ourselves. He glances once more at the rising line on the graph, the question of who will outlast whom. 3 days after the briefing at Rechlin, Karl is standing on a rattling carriage floor, one gloved hand braced against the wall of a troop wagon that smells of coal smoke and cold leather. Outside the grimy window, the landscape of northern Germany slides by bare fields, skeletal trees, the occasional village church spire. Every few kilometers, blackened scars appear where sidings and warehouses once stood. The train slows as it approaches the outskirts of Magdeburg. You can almost feel the mood in the wagon change. Conversation dies away. Men look out at what used to be an ordinary industrial town and now looks like a mouth with teeth kicked in. Roofs peeled back, walls collapsed inward, smoke stains clawing upward from empty window frames. This is where one of the BMW engine plants stands, or used to stand, at the station. Karl steps down onto a platform dusted with brick powder instead of snow. A gust of wind lifts a cloud of fine white dust, stinging his eyes. Across the tracks, a passenger coach sits with every window blown out, its seats dusted with glass. Above, sheets of corrugated metal hang from twisted rafters, creaking softly. A major from the armaments ministry meets him and Weber at the end of the platform. His uniform is immaculate, but there is dried mortar dust in the lines of his face. Oberingenieur Müller, the major says, saluting quickly. Thank you for coming on such short notice. The Reichsmarshal wants an assessment of how quickly we can restore production. Karl looks past him at a row of low buildings in the distance. Cranes are already working there, their jibs silhouetted against a pale sky as they lift debris from what must be the assembly halls. Then let us see what we have left to restore, Karl says. The walk from the station to the plant is short, but it feels longer. The nearer they get, the more the scale of the damage reveals itself. Where there were once neat rows of brick workshops, there are now open courtyards of shattered brick and broken machines. A row of lathes lies on its side like felled trees. A gantry crane has collapsed across a bay where engine blocks used to move in steady procession. They step into what remains of a machining hall. Only 2 of the 4 walls still stand, and those are cracked. The roof is gone entirely. Snowflakes drift down through the open rectangle of sky, melting when they touch the still warm carcass of a milling machine that caught fire during the last raid. Weber stops dead. This is where they board the crankcases, he whispers. Karl can see it in his mind. He visited once before the war began, when everything smelled of cutting fluid and hot steel, and the biggest worry was the alignment of a new line shaft. Now the air smells of wet ash and burnt oil. The concrete floors cratered where bombs came through the roof before exploding, hurling chunks of machine and men everywhere. The plant director, a pale man with coal-rimmed eyes, leads them through what is left of his kingdom. Every few meters he points. That was the heat treatment shop. The tempering ovens are destroyed. A little farther on. Here we did the nitriding on crankshafts. The gas plant that supplied the ovens took a direct hit. They come at last to a smaller building on the far side of the complex. Its roof still holds, although one corner has sagged. Inside, it is crowded with salvaged equipment, spare parts, and men in overalls who look as though they have not slept properly in weeks. "This is what we could save," the director says. "Some grinding machines, a few lathes, the fixture racks. Enough to do limited work. Once we restore power." The main generator station was destroyed. Carl runs his fingers along the bed of a lathe. The ways are scored where flying debris struck them. The headstock bears a new dent. These machines were not made for this kind of abuse. He thinks of the Thunderbolt's engine stand at Rechlin, of the neat row of pistons, the gleaming turbocharger, the charts of American production. Then he looks at the battered machines in front of him, the exhausted men, the hole in the roof where rain and snow find their way in. "How many engines can you produce now?" he asks quietly. The director gives a bitter little laugh. "Now none. In 3 months. Perhaps a handful. With priority on power restoration, and if the raids stop. But the drawings from the ministry speak of higher output than last year. They still send targets as if nothing has happened." The major shifts uncomfortably. "We are redistributing work to other plants. The Reich will not accept defeatist talk." Carl feels irritation rise, but he keeps his voice level. "I'm not speaking of defeat. I'm speaking of arithmetic." He gestures around them. "Each BMW engine requires so many hours on machines like these. So many kilograms of alloy steel, of high-grade aluminum, of copper. You see the state of your plant. You know the state of our railways. You have seen the copper stripped from telephone lines, the aluminum taken from church bells." The director nods once, slowly. "In Rechlin," Carl continues, "we are dissecting an American engine that could run 100 hours without major issue, perhaps more. Our own front-line engines often require significant work after half that, sometimes less, especially with the fuel quality we can now provide. So to keep one squadron in the air, we must build more engines, ship more spares, expend more labor just to stand still." He pauses, letting that sink in. Weber is watching him with a tight jaw, as if hearing his own thoughts laid out aloud. "And while we struggle to rebuild this one factory," Carl says, "our intelligence reports that in Detroit and Hartford and Seattle they are adding new lines, not rebuilding old ones. Their power stations still stand. Their machine tools are still aligned, untouched by bomb fragments. Their training schools are still turning out fitters and machinists." The major opens his mouth, closes it again, then says stiffly, "We have our own new aircraft coming. The 262, the 335, revolutionary designs. The Führer believes such weapons will change the balance." Carl thinks of the fragile jet prototypes that come to Rechlin, temperamental and precious, each one demanding rare alloys and a swarm of technicians. He thinks of the neat, almost boring reliability of the R-2800 parts laid out on their tables. "Revolutionary ideas do not shorten the time needed to harden a bearing shell," he says. "They do not double the output of a damaged plant." He turns back to the plant director. "How many of your skilled machinists were killed in the raid?" The man's gaze drops. 32 dead. Another 40 badly injured. A dozen evacuated with their families. Many of the rest are now in the Volkssturm. They are old men, but they are still called up. There is the real wound, Carl thinks. Machines can be replaced, given time and steel. But men who know how to scrape a bearing, how to read the song of a cutter biting into metal, how to coax a worn machine into one more year of service, they are not easily found. He feels again the weight of the American piston in his hand. He remembers the smooth face of the R-2800 valve after 100 hours. He hears, in imagination, the steady drone of engines over the Atlantic, built by men whose factories have never seen a bomb crater. As they leave the plant, snow begins to fall in earnest, coating the piles of rubble in a thin, deceptive purity. The Major mutters something about increased flak protection, about night fighter support, about the next raid being repelled. Carl walks in silence. The rising line on his production graph has already begun to flatten in his mind, bent downward by the weight of destruction he has just walked through. No enthusiastic report, no optimistic projection can erase the simple truth he has seen here, laid out in brick and twisted steel, back on the platform, waiting for the train. He hears the distant rumble of engines high above the clouds. You imagine looking up with him, eyes straining, knowing that somewhere up there a formation is already on its way to some other target. Somewhere, in one of those aircraft, a Thunderbolt escorts them, its radial turning with tireless indifference. Carl closes his eyes for a moment. In the darkness behind his lids, all the numbers collide. Hours between overhauls. Engines per month. Skilled men per machine. There is no arrangement in which they come out ahead. A week later, frost still rims the airfield at Rechlin, but the sky is a hard, brittle blue. Out on the concrete, the captured Thunderbolt looks strangely naked. Panels have been refitted where they had to be, gaps taped over, access doors latched, the engine reassembled with almost reverent care, weights at idle power, its big propeller a blurred grey disc. The sound is different from any German aircraft on the field, deeper, steadier, like a distant train in a steady climb rather than a racing sports car. Each cylinder fires with the same dull, confident beat. No misfires, no coughs, just a heavy, relentless rhythm that you can feel in your ribs as you stand near the wing. Carl stands with his hands in his coat pockets, collar turned up against the cold. Beside him, Hauptmann Dieter Hagen, one of Rechlin's most experienced test pilots, is half listening to the rhythm, half watching the mechanics complete their last checks. "You are certain you put it back together correctly?" "Herr Oberingenieur?" Hagen asks, smiling with one corner of his mouth. Carl nods. "We followed the manual." He lifts a hand and waves a small booklet. The American maintenance manual is printed on cheap paper with clear diagrams and step-by-step instructions. The thing that has impressed him most is how little it assumes about the intelligence or prior knowledge of its reader. It is written so that any squadron mechanic can use it in the dark with a torch between his teeth and still not make a fatal mistake. Hagen glances at the booklet. Everything spelled out for the idiot at the front, or for a boy who was at school last year. Carl replies, "That is who will be turning spanners on this in some muddy field in Italy or France." The last chocks are pulled away. A ground crewman climbs down from the wing, gives Hagen a thumbs up, and trots clear of the blast. The test pilot pulls on his helmet, tightens the strap with a practiced jerk, and climbs the ladder into the cockpit. When the canopy closes, the world seems to shrink around the Thunderbolt. The engine note rises as Hagen advances the throttle, checks the magnetos, cycles the propeller blades. Each change is smooth, predictable. The needle on the oil pressure gauge inside the cockpit, Carl knows, is steady. The P-47 begins to roll. Its wide undercarriage and big tail make it look almost clumsy as it bounces slightly over a crack in the taxiway. But as it reaches the head of the runway and swings into the wind, there is a hint of menace in the way the big propeller claws the air. Throttle forward. The radial bellows, not briefly, but as if it could do this all day. The Thunderbolt gathers speed with a slow but undeniable push. Tail rising, wings steady. Then, with a lazy sort of inevitability, it lifts off the concrete and climbs into the cold German sky that is supposed to belong to the Luftwaffe. Carl watches it go, a dark shape against the pale blue. It climbs at what looks like a modest angle compared to the sharp, eager clawing of a Messerschmitt. But the rate never seems to sag. The engine note stays the same, a steady grind that just keeps going as the fighter becomes smaller and smaller. Beside him, Weber has his notebook out, pencil poised. Fuel flow estimate, he asks. High, Carl says absently. But they have fuel. That is another advantage, high above. The Thunderbolt performs a slow climbing turn, then levels out. Minutes pass. It is a small speck now, occasionally glinting as the sun catches its belly. The engine, even at this distance, can still be felt more than heard. A faint vibration in the air rather than a distinct note. Time stretches. 10 minutes. 15. 20. No change. No sudden drop to idle. No suspicious coughing. Just that same distant grind. A lesser engine, tuned too finely, might have run hot during the climb or stumbled when the pilot jockeyed the throttle. This one simply does what it was built to do. At last, Hagen brings it back down. The Thunderbolt drops out of the high sky with surprising speed, its thick wings and heavy frame not enough to slow its dive. At low altitude, he levels, makes a fast pass over the field that rattles windows, then circles and touches down in a shower of rubber smoke. The landing is firm, but sure, the wide track undercarriage forgiving his haste. When he climbs down from the cockpit, his cheeks are flushed, eyes bright. He pulls off his helmet and runs a hand through flattened hair. Well, Carl asks. Hagen shrugs. But there is a glint of respect in his gaze as he looks back at the aircraft. She is heavy. You feel it. Controls are not as light as a 109. Roll is slower than a Focke-Wulf. You do not dance in her. You work. He pauses. But you cannot seem to hurt the engine. I pushed full power for most of the climb. Temperatures stayed within limits. The automatic systems look after you. Mixture, boost, everything. You can concentrate on flying and fighting, not on nursing the machine. He taps his temple. In our fighters, a pilot needs a head full of numbers and a good feel for what is happening under the cowling. In this, he needs to know where the throttle is and when to pull the trigger. The rest is almost optional. Weber scribbles furiously. Carl studies Hagen's face. Would you take it into combat? Hagen hesitates. If I had to dogfight at low level, I would prefer a Focke-Wulf. If I wanted to climb to meet bombers at 10,000 meters and then dive on them and still have power left to fight off their escorts, I might choose this. And if I knew I had to fly every day, in all weather, with minimum maintenance, and I wished to survive, I would certainly think about it. They walk together to the nose. A mechanic opens a small access panel so that Carl can peer inside with a flashlight. The oil inside glows clean and amber on the dipstick. No metal flecks. No foaming. The cylinder head temperatures, noted immediately after landing, are all where they should be. It is like a man who eats too much and drinks too much, Hagen says, half joking, but who never seems to fall ill. You cannot admire his elegance, but you start to envy his health. The line of that makes Carl actually smile, but the expression fades quickly. You understand what this means, he says quietly. If they can give this engine to thousands of pilots who are not as skilled as you, and it still brings most of them home, then even a clumsy fighter becomes very dangerous. Hagen's gaze drops to the concrete between his boots. We can still outfly them, he says. But there is less conviction in the words than in the rumble of the engine now ticking as it cools. Carl looks again at the Thunderbolt. In his mind, he sees not one machine, but a line of them stretching away into the haze, each with the same radial, each built to the same standard, each serviced by a man working from the same clear manual under electric lights that never flicker for lack of power. For the first time, the thought arrives fully formed, not as a whisper, but as a statement. Even if they made no further advances in design, even if every German engineer worked without sleep, the war of engines is already decided. That night, Rechlin lies under a blackout sky. The airfield is a pool of darkness on the map. But in the workshops and drafting rooms, dim lamps glow behind heavy curtains. Somewhere a generator hums. Occasionally, the distant thud of flak rolls across the horizon. A reminder that someone else is being visited by bombers tonight. In a small office overlooking the test hangars, Carl sits at a metal desk, coat still on, a cold cup of ersatz coffee at his elbow. The captured maintenance manual for the Thunderbolt lies open beside his blotter, pages held flat by a paperweight. On the wall hangs a large schematic he and Weber assembled from their teardown notes. It shows the R-2800 and its turbocharger as a clean web of lines and symbols. Around it, pinned in tighter clusters, are their own engine diagrams, some revised in red pencil, some covered in question marks where material substitutions have forced new compromises. Outside, on the snow-dusted apron, the Thunderbolt is a low, dark shape under a tarpaulin. Its engine is cold, but in Carl's mind he can still hear that steady, untroubled rumble. He bends to his task. At the top of the report he has already written, in a neat, careful hand, to Reichsluftfahrtministerium from Oberingenieur, Karl-Heinz Möller, Rechlin Test Center, subject technical evaluation of captured P-47 fighter and R-2800 engine. Beneath, pages of close-written notes summarize what they have measured and seen. Power ratings, component lives, observed behavior in flight, material assessments. He has described the engine as robust, conservative in its design margins, and suited to high-volume production with minimal need for highly skilled labor. He has noted the turbocharger as complex in installation but straightforward for the pilot, providing high-altitude performance with automatic control systems. All of that is accurate. None of it says what he truly wants to write. Weber sits opposite him, shoulders hunched, rechecking a table of comparative overhaul intervals. He looks up finally, rubbing his eyes. "You will add your final recommendation tonight, Herr Oberingenieur." Carl nods slowly. "Yes, it appears I must." He stares at the blank space at the end of the report. The words that want to come will not fit in the usual language of memos and conclusions. "We could suggest adopting some of their practices," Weber offers, trying to be optimistic. "Standardized fasteners, simpler access to components, more automatic controls, perhaps in the next series of engines." Carl gives a tired half-smile. "Yes, we can propose improvements. We will improve some things. We will gain a few hours here, a little reliability there." He turns his chair slightly, looking out the window. Past his reflection, he can see the faint outline of the Thunderbolt and, farther off, the darker bulk of a hangar where experimental jets sleep, each one as fragile and demanding as a racehorse. "What we cannot propose," he says quietly, "is 12 years of uninterrupted industrial expansion, a continent-sized base of machine tools, an ocean between one's factories and the enemy. Those are not engineering changes." Weber is silent for a moment. When he speaks, his voice is barely above a whisper. "Then what do you write?" Carl studies the dip of the pen nib in his hand. He thinks of Magdeburg, of the ruined machine halls, of the valve from the Thunderbolt that still sits in a tray on his shelf, mocking their best efforts with its unremarkable perfection. "I write the truth as far as they will allow themselves to read it," he says. "That this engine is not to be underestimated, that its reliability and the ease with which it can be maintained make it an ideal weapon in a long war, that we must expect large numbers of such machines in all future operations, and that our tactics must account for their persistence." He hesitates, then adds, more softly, "And perhaps, between the lines, I will try to say that the war of production is already lost." Weber looks at him sharply. "You cannot write that." "Of course not in those words," Carl replies. A faint, bitter smile touches his mouth. There are phrases one uses: adverse industrial ratio, strategic disadvantage in material resources. People who wish to understand will understand. He bends to the paper and begins to write his final paragraphs. The pen scratches steadily. In formal language, he explains that the R-2800 evaluated in the P-47 airframe demonstrates a combination of durability, power, and simplicity, which, taken together, more than compensate for the aircraft's weight and lack of agility. He notes that American pilots require less technical training to operate their engines effectively, that maintenance crews can keep high sortie rates with fewer failures. He recommends that German pilots avoid prolonged turning engagements against Thunderbolts and instead exploit brief advantages in climb and initial acceleration where they still exist. He emphasizes that any plan which assumes mechanical attrition will significantly reduce the number of operational American fighters is unrealistic. When he is finished, he sets the pen down and flexes his cramped fingers. "Read it," he says. Weber takes the pages and studies them in silence. As he reads the last lines, his jaw tightens. He looks up. "It is as far as you can go," he says. "Anyone with eyes will see what you mean." Carl leans back in his chair. The office feels very small. Beyond the walls, he can imagine miles of rail lines, bombed and patched, dragging overloaded wagons toward half-crippled factories. Beyond that, oceans flecked with ships, bringing more steel and copper and oil to the enemy's assembly lines. He remembers standing before the disassembled Thunderbolt, the moment he realized that every part on that table implied 1,000 others, each identical, waiting on some distant shelf. "If we had captured this engine in 1940, he says, voice distant, perhaps we could have done something, changed our designs early, focused on what matters in a long war." Weber says nothing. But now, Carl continues. "Our cities burn. Our young machinists are at the front with rifles. We gamble on miracle weapons while they refine the art of building the same good machine 100,000 times. The gap is not closing. It widens with each month." He reaches over and closes the American manual, then slides it into a drawer. The dull thud as it closes sounds, to him, almost like a verdict. Outside, the rumble of engines drifts faintly from far to the west. For a moment he cannot tell if they belong to German night fighters or to another stream of bombers guided by their own steady radials. In his mind, all those sounds blend into a single truth power projected through the air by men who have mastered the craft of making engines that simply work. The report will go to Berlin in the morning. It will be read, summarized, filed. Some of its recommendations will be adopted in part, others ignored. But nothing in it can change the fact that somewhere, tonight, another R-2800 is being lowered onto a new airframe. Another Thunderbolt is being rolled out into daylight. Carl sits alone for a while after Weber has gone, listening to the faint buzz of the lamp and the occasional tick of cooling metal from the hangars below. He thinks of the young men who will sit behind engines like the one he has taken apart. Men who will never know his name, who will never see the graphs and tables that say why their side will win. He feels no sudden dramatic shift, no thunderclap of revelation, only a deep, persistent certainty that settles into him like cold. They are still designing finer blades for a sword. The enemy has already built a factory that turns out hammers. At last he stands, gathers the report, and places it carefully in the outgoing tray. He turns off the lamp. The office falls into darkness. Outside, under its tarpaulin, the captured Thunderbolt sleeps on German soil, its alien radial engine cooling in the winter night. One small sample of an industrial tide that has already risen too high to turn back.